What if the person who destroyed your family had been living 1 mile from your front door for 47 years? What if they coached Little League, greeted neighbors by name, attended church, and built a quiet, ordinary life, while your family spent nearly 5 decades with no answers, no closure, and no peace? What if law enforcement had actually spoken to this person within weeks of the crime, looked him in the eye, asked him the hard questions, and then walked away without a single reason to hold him? And what if the only thing that finally broke 47 years of silence was a trace of biological material so small, so deteriorated, that every forensic laboratory in the country had already declared it worthless? These are not hypothetical questions. Every single one of them is the verified, documented reality of one of the most quietly devastating unsolved cases in the history of Fort Worth, Texas. Before we go any further, this documentary covers a case involving the disappearance and death of a young woman. All details presented here are factual and handled with care, but the nature of the subject matter means viewer discretion is advised. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome to Vanished Without Trace. This is where the cases that took decades to crack finally get the coverage they deserve. Cases where the investigation runs longer than most people's careers. Cases where families waited longer than most people wait for anything. Hit subscribe right now, because we go deeper than the headlines every single week. And if you are already part of this community, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. This channel has viewers across continents, and we want to know who is in the room. Now, to the case. February 1974, Fort Worth, Texas. A 17-year-old girl went to a Valentine's Day dance with her high school boyfriend. She was happy. She was dressed up. By every account, she was looking forward to the night ahead. She never made it home. Her name was Carla Walker. And for 47 years, the man responsible for her death lived less than a mile from the family that never stopped looking for answers. The investigation that followed would span nearly 5 decades, cycle through multiple suspects, absorb a false confession from another state, exhaust multiple rounds of forensic testing, and ultimately hinge on a scientific method so new that no Texas court had ever seen it before. By the time it ended, 2 detectives would sit across a table from a man in his late 70s and finally get the answer that one family had been waiting 47 years to hear. Nobody else has put this case together the way we are about to. Every layer, every detail, every turn in this investigation that the standard coverage never reached. Stay with us, this one matters. Before this documentary goes to the crime, it goes to the person. Because in true crime coverage, victims have a way of being reduced to a case number and a photograph that only circulates after something has gone wrong. Carla Walker deserves more than that framing, and the facts of who she was matter to understanding everything that follows. Carla Walker was born on May 18, 1956, in Fort Worth, Texas. By February of 1974, she was 17 years old and a junior at Castleberry High School, located in the city of River Oaks just outside central Fort Worth. She was not someone who blended in. People who knew Carla remembered her specifically and consistently. She was outgoing, direct, and warm in a way that crossed social lines. Different groups of students, different social circles at Castleberry, they all described her the same way. Approachable, genuinely kind. The type of person who made most people feel comfortable around her. She was a member of the Castleberry High School cheerleading squad. In a Texas high school in the early 1970s, that was not a minor role. School identity, Friday night football, and community engagement were central to daily life in Fort Worth at that time. Carla was an active part of all of it. She also valued punctuality in a way that people close to her noticed. Being kept waiting genuinely irritated her. She held herself to a personal standard and expected the people around her to respect it. That is not a trivial detail. It tells you something concrete about who she was. Someone with a clear sense of her own time and how it should be treated. Then there was Rodney McCoy. Rodney was Carla's boyfriend. He was the varsity quarterback at Castleberry High School, athletic, well-known, and by every account completely devoted to her. By the standards of high school relationships in 1974, theirs was considered a serious commitment. He had given her a promise ring. In that era, a promise ring carried real social weight. It was a public statement that two people were building toward a future together. Friends of the couple said they genuinely believed Rodney and Carla would last. The ring was a symbol of that commitment, and it would resurface later in this investigation in a way nobody expected. The Walker family home in Benbrook was warm and close. Carla's parents were present and engaged. Her youngest brother, James Young Walker, known to everyone as Jim, was 7 years younger than Carla and looked up to her in the way that younger siblings do when the older one commands a room. Fort Worth in 1974 was not a community living on edge. Benbrook was the kind of neighborhood where parents sent their kids out on Saturday nights without significant concern. Teenagers attended dances, cruised local strips, went to drive-ins. Doors were left unlocked. There was a shared, unspoken confidence that the neighborhood was safe. That was the world Carla Walker lived in, stable, warm, forward-looking. A life that, to everyone who knew her, felt entirely secure. On the evening of Saturday, February 16, 1974, Carla and Rodney were preparing to attend the Castleberry High School Valentine's dance. Rodney had ordered a corsage for her, but he was running behind picking it up. Knowing how Carla felt about punctuality, that created a moment of friction. She was dressed and ready, and she was not pleased about waiting. She called a friend that evening to express exactly that. She said she was considering not going at all. Her friend talked her out of it. Rodney was on his way. It was Valentine's night. Go and enjoy it. Carla went. Before they left, her parents took photographs of the two of them together, corsage pinned, dressed for the evening, heading out the door. Her aunt and uncle were at the house. Everyone expected the couple back later that night with stories from the dance. The photograph taken in that living room, Carla in her dress, Rodney beside her, became one of the last images of her alive. Nobody standing in that house, as the door closed behind them, had any idea that Carla Walker was not coming back through it. There was no warning, no prior incident, no reason for alarm. Just a 17-year-old girl who got irritated that her boyfriend was running late, got talked into attending a school dance, smiled for a photograph in her parents' living room, and then disappeared. Now that you know who Carla Walker was, it is time to talk about what happened to her. It starts in a parking lot, late at night, on a holiday that was supposed to be about something entirely different. If you are not yet subscribed to Vanished Without Trace, this is the moment to do it. We cover the cases that take decades to resolve, the investigations most channels never go deep enough on, and the details that rarely surface in shorter coverage. Subscribe now and drop your location in the comments. We want to know exactly where our community is watching from tonight. Saturday, February 16th, 1974, started like any normal weekend evening in Fort Worth. The Castleberry High School Valentine's dance was held that night at the school. Students showed up dressed for the occasion. Music played. It was the kind of event that defined Saturday nights in 1970s Texas. School community, seasonal celebration, teenagers making the most of an evening out. Carla and Rodney arrived together, connected with their group of friends, and spent the early part of the night exactly as planned. Dancing, socializing, a normal high school evening. At some point, they connected with another couple, and the four of them decided to leave the dance and go cruising. In Fort Worth in 1974, this was a routine weekend activity. Teenagers drove a designated local strip, back and forth, pulling over to talk, connecting with other cars. Ordinary, low stakes, something hundreds of young people in that city did on any given Saturday. Close to midnight, the female half of the other couple mentioned she had a curfew. Rodney drove them back to the school to drop them off, leaving him and Carla alone for the rest of the night. Around 12:20 in the morning on February 17th, Rodney stopped at a local fast food restaurant and bought Carla something to eat. Shortly after, Carla needed to use the restroom. Rodney pulled into the parking lot of the Ridgelia Bowling Alley on Camp Bowie Boulevard in Fort Worth. The Ridgelia was a well-known establishment, open late and publicly accessible. They went inside briefly, then returned to the car. What happened next took less than 60 seconds to begin, and nothing would ever be the same after it. Rodney and Carla were sitting in the front seat of the parked car when the passenger side door was pulled open from the outside with significant force. A man reached in and grabbed Carla. With his other hand, he pointed a firearm at Rodney and pulled the trigger. The weapon did not fire, it malfunctioned. The man then used that same firearm to strike Rodney repeatedly about the head until Rodney lost consciousness. As Rodney was losing awareness, Carla could be heard calling out, telling the man to stop, calling for her father, telling him to leave Rodney alone. Those were the last words anyone who knew Carla Walker would ever hear her speak. When Rodney regained consciousness, he was alone in the parking lot. Carla was gone. The man was gone. There was no sign of either of them. Disoriented and in physical distress, Rodney made the only decision that made sense. He drove to the Walker family home. It was approximately 1:30 in the morning on February 17th when his car came to a hard stop against the curb outside the Walker residence. He was at the front door within seconds, pounding on it, calling out, his face covered in blood, barely holding himself together. Jim Walker, Carla's youngest brother, came to see what was happening. What he found at that door was Rodney McCoy in a state of visible physical distress, bleeding from head injuries, begging for help. Carla's father came to the door immediately. Rodney told him what had happened. Mr. Walker did not pause. He got into his car and drove directly to the Ridgelia Bowling Alley. Carla was not there. What was there, on the ground near where the car had been parked, was a detached ammunition magazine, specifically identified as belonging to a Ruger Mark I .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. It had been dropped during the confrontation. That magazine became the first and most critical piece of physical evidence in the entire investigation. Fort Worth Police Department responded quickly. Rodney was transported to the hospital for treatment. Within hours, an active missing persons case had been opened for Carla Walker. Once medically stable, Rodney gave investigators a description of the attacker, a white male, believed to be in his mid-20s, with what Rodney described as a distinct regional Texas accent, a cowboy inflection. In the darkness and sudden chaos of what had happened, a more detailed physical description was not possible. One early complication came from Rodney's initial account at the Walker door. In the shock of the moment, he had used the word, they, as in, they have her. That single word led investigators to initially assume multiple people were involved. As the account was reviewed more carefully, it became clear the attack was carried out by a single individual. But those early hours of misaligned focus cost time. Fort Worth PD canvassed the area around the bowling alley. They interviewed students from the dance, witnesses from the surrounding neighborhood, and anyone who might have seen something on Camp Bowie Boulevard that night. The community responded with volunteers. People genuinely wanted to help find her. 3 days passed, with no confirmed information on Carla's location. Then, on Wednesday, February 20th, 1974, 4 days after she was taken, officers conducting a search of drainage areas along Benbrook Lake made a discovery that ended the missing persons phase of this case and began something far more serious. In a concrete drainage culvert beneath a rural road, they found Carla Walker. Crime scene officers documented everything. One brought an 8mm film camera and recorded the scene on footage, an extremely rare piece of evidence for a case from that era, and one that would prove important to investigators reopening the case decades later. Among the items recovered near the culvert was Carla's promise ring, the one Rodney had given her. It was found in the dirt near her body. None of her other jewelry had been disturbed. Only that ring had been separated from her. That specific detail, one item removed, while everything else remained intact. became one of the most closely examined points in the early investigation. The medical examiner confirmed that Carla Walker had been the victim of a violent crime. The cause of death was strangulation. She was 17 years old. The night the Walker family received official confirmation of what had been found, a news reporter arrived at their front door before law enforcement had formally notified them. The reporter asked Mr. and Mrs. Walker for a statement. The reporter was removed from the property. A short time later, Tarrant County law enforcement arrived and delivered the official notification. Jim Walker has described that moment in subsequent years as one that remains completely intact in his memory. Every detail, every face in the room, and the specific moment when his father, a man he had never seen show visible grief before, finally did. Carla Walker was gone, and the person responsible had vanished just as completely. The investigation was now a homicide case, and it was only just beginning. Did you know about this case before today? Drop a comment below and tell us. And if you have been watching this channel since the very beginning, put the number 1 in the comments right now. We read every single one. The discovery of Carla Walker's body on February 20th, 1974, shifted everything. Fort Worth Police Department was now working a homicide with limited physical evidence. One traumatized eyewitness, a dropped ammunition magazine, and a crime scene that had been exposed to outdoor conditions for 4 days. What they had, they worked with precision. The ammunition magazine from the Ridgely parking lot had been identified as belonging to a Ruger Mark I .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. This was a target pistol, popular with sport shooters, but not so commonly owned that tracking registered owners in the Tarrant County area was impossible. Investigators compiled a list of every registered Ruger Mark I owner in the region and began working through it systematically. Door to door, name by name, each person was asked to produce their firearm for inspection. Every single person on that list produced their weapon. Every person except one. This individual told investigators his Ruger had been taken from his vehicle several weeks before the night Carla was taken, a timeline that lined up precisely with when someone might acquire a weapon in advance. Then, in the weeks following Carla's death, the same man had purchased a replacement magazine for that exact model of firearm, a replacement for a gun he claimed had already been stolen. He was questioned, he was polygraphed, he passed. Without a forensic link to the crime scene, investigators had no legal basis to hold him. He remained in the file as a person of interest, but the case against him stalled immediately. That was the first wall. 3 months later, in May of 1974, a second lead emerged. A man named Tommy Ray Nelland had been arrested in connection with the abduction and assault of a woman on the east side of Fort Worth. The method bore enough similarity to Carla's case that investigators moved quickly to explore the connection. Rodney McCoy was brought in for a voice lineup. During the attack, Rodney had registered the perpetrator's voice, specifically that regional Texas accent, and certain words the man had spoken. Each person in the lineup was asked to repeat a specific phrase from the night of the attack. When Tommy Ray Nelland spoke, Rodney identified his voice as a match. It was a significant development, but Nelland had a verified alibi for the night of February 16th. Multiple people confirmed his location. Without physical evidence connecting him to the bowling alley parking lot, a voice identification alone could not support criminal charges. Nelland was eliminated as a suspect in Carla's case. The third wall came in 1977. A man named Jimmy Dean Sasser, sitting in a Tennessee jail cell, contacted authorities and confessed to the murder of Carla Walker. Sasser was extradited to Texas. He sat down with investigators and gave what appeared at first to be a detailed account. Initial charges were filed, but as detectives worked through the specifics of his confession, the problems multiplied quickly. Key details he provided directly contradicted facts about the case that had never been made public, facts that only the actual perpetrator could have known. Sasser did not know them. The charges were dropped. After speaking with people close to Sasser, investigators reached a clear conclusion. His motivation was not guilt. He wanted to be transferred from Tennessee to Texas. The confession was a calculated move, not an admission of responsibility. By the end of the 1970s, the case had no viable suspects, no physical evidence linking anyone to the crime, and no clear investigative path forward. What it did carry, what no dead end could erase, was the impact the case had left on Fort Worth itself. Before February 1974, Benbrook was a community where people moved through daily life with genuine ease. Doors went unlocked. Teenagers came and went on weekends without their parents carrying serious concern. There was a baseline sense of security that felt natural and earned. That changed in a single night. After Carla's body was found, behavioral patterns across the community shifted measurably. Doors that had never been locked were locked. Parents who had previously given their teenagers weekend freedom started asking harder questions. Women and girls stopped going places alone. The question that circulated at football games, at school events, at every ordinary gathering was the same: is the person who did this somewhere in this crowd right now? Friends of Carla described it directly. They stopped wanting to go out. Some said they did not want to stay in Fort Worth at all. The case had fundamentally changed how they experienced the city. For Jim Walker, the years after Carla's death were not characterized by passive grief. They were active, restless, and driven by something sharper than sadness. In 1979, 5 years after Carla was found, Jim drove out to the culvert at Benbrook Lake where his sister's body had been discovered. He went alone. He brought a hammer, a flashlight, and a knife. He sat inside that culvert in the dark and waited. His reasoning was simple and entirely human. He believed that if the person responsible ever returned to that location, he would be there, and he would not let the moment pass. No one came. Jim Walker drove home. The case remained unsolved, and the man responsible continued living his life undisturbed, in a house investigators would eventually confirm, located approximately 1 mile from the Walker family's front door. Nobody knew that yet in 1979. The case was cold. The leads had run out, and the Fort Worth Police Department had no choice but to file it in the category every victim's family dreads most: unsolved. Do you think every police department in the country should maintain a dedicated cold case unit? Because the alternative is exactly what happened here. Years of silence while a family waited. Tell us what you think in the comments. And if this documentary is giving you the kind of depth that shorter coverage never does, subscribe to Vanished Without Trace right now. We are only getting deeper from here. The Carla Walker case sat without forward movement for years. Not officially closed, not actively worked, just sitting in the system, documented, preserved, but frozen without a viable lead to follow. That was the reality from the late 1970s through the 1980s and well into the 1990s. Fort Worth grew around the case. The Ridglia bowling alley on Camp Bowie Boulevard eventually closed its doors. The teenagers who had attended that Valentine's dance in 1974 became adults with lives, careers, and families of their own. Rodney McCoy built what people on the outside would describe as a successful life, but those close to him understood that the night of February 16th, 1974 had left a permanent mark. He had been the last person with Carla. He had been present when she was taken. And in the absence of a solved case, a quiet undercurrent of public suspicion, the kind that always surrounds the surviving boyfriend in an unsolved case, had followed him for decades without ever fully going away. Carla's parents never received answers. They both passed away before the case was resolved. Several of her siblings also died without ever knowing who was responsible. Jim Walker, her youngest brother, became one of the last remaining members of a family that had spent decades waiting for a phone call that never came. Then came 2009. Forensic DNA technology had been advancing at a significant pace since the early 1990s, when genetic evidence first began appearing consistently in American courtrooms. By the late 2000s, law enforcement agencies across the country were systematically revisiting old evidence from unsolved cases, running samples through updated analytical processes that had simply not existed when the original investigations were conducted. Fort Worth investigators sent Carla's dress, recovered from the crime scene in February 1974 and held in evidence storage ever since, to a forensic laboratory for DNA analysis. The results came back with a partial DNA profile, incomplete, not sufficient on its own to identify a specific individual, but it was something that had not existed in this investigation before. Confirmed biological material from an unknown male, recovered from evidence connected to the crime scene. That partial profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database maintained by the FBI that allows law enforcement to cross-reference crime scene profiles against profiles collected from individuals with qualifying criminal histories. The search returned no matches. No CODIS hit meant no direct identification. The profile confirmed that an unknown male had been involved in what happened to Carla Walker, but without a database match, it could not tell investigators who that male was. What it did accomplish was meaningful in a different way. It quietly redirected the investigative framework. Rodney McCoy had remained a theoretical question in the case file for years: the time gap in his account, the location of the promise ring near the body. But with biological material from a separate, unidentified male now confirmed on Carla's dress, investigators had documented evidence that another man was involved in what happened to her. That changed how the case was approached going forward. The investigation slowed again after 2010. Without a database match, there was no immediate next step available. The Walker file went back into the system, no longer entirely dormant, but not moving with any momentum either. The next significant development in this case would not come from a database. It would come from a phone call. In 2017, Jim Walker reached out to the Fort Worth Police Department. He had learned that the case had been quietly reopened and that investigative resources were being directed toward it again. He wanted to know where things stood, and he made clear, with the directness of a man who had spent most of his adult life waiting for answers, that his family still needed them. The detective who took that call was Lee Wagner. Wagner was working as a detective within Fort Worth PD at the time. She had a reputation for working case files with unusual thoroughness, the kind of investigator who read every document rather than scanning for summary points. She and Jim Walker had a long conversation. She listened to what he was telling her not just as a description of an old case, but as an account of what nearly 5 decades without resolution had done to a family. Wagner committed to the case, fully. In 2019, she was joined by Detective Jeff Bennett, assigned to the Homicide Cold Case Unit. Bennett came to the Carla Walker case without prior personal history with the file. Wagner asked him to start from scratch, read everything, build a completely fresh picture. What Bennett found when he opened the case boxes was substantial in volume. 4 large banker boxes of documentation, witness statements, interview transcripts, evidence logs, tip records going back to February 1974, decades of genuine investigative effort from detectives who had worked hard and hit walls at every turn. Bennett read every page. From that review, he and Wagner constructed a new suspect list. When they finished cross-referencing every name, timeline, and connection present in the documentation, that list contained 85 individuals, people who appeared in the case record, and could not be fully eliminated without further investigation. They began working through the list. They conducted interviews. They collected voluntary DNA samples from men connected to the case file, friends, acquaintances, anyone Carla had contact within the period leading up to her death. Each sample was tested against the partial profile from the dress. Not one of them matched. The unknown male in the evidence remained unidentified. But Wagner and Bennett were not done, because in 2019, a call came in from someone whose name carried significant weight in forensic investigation circles, and that call changed the direction of the case entirely. Before we get there, Take 30 seconds right now and share this documentary with someone in your life who follows true crime. The Carla Walker case is one that most people outside of Texas have never heard of. That is worth changing. Share it. Subscribe if you have not already. Because the next chapter is where this investigation stops being a cold case and starts becoming something else entirely. In 2019, Wagner and Bennett were working through an 85-name suspect list, collecting DNA samples one by one and finding no matches. The unknown male profile from the dress remained exactly that. CODIS had returned nothing. Voluntary testing had returned nothing. And the biological material in evidence storage was not getting any less degraded with time. Cold case DNA evidence deteriorates. Every passing year, every change in storage conditions, every handling reduces the integrity of biological material collected decades earlier. The evidence from February 1974 had already been in storage for 45 years. How much longer it would remain viable for any kind of advanced testing was an open question. Then Paul Holes called. Holes is a retired forensic investigator and criminalist from Contra Costa County, California. He spent decades working complex cold cases and is best known as one of the key investigators whose work contributed directly to the 2018 identification and arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, confirmed as the Golden State Killer, responsible for at least 13 homicides and more than 50 criminal assaults across California between 1974 and 1986. Holes retired just days before DeAngelo's arrest, but his investigative work had been central to breaking that case open. By 2019, Holes had moved into documentary work and was developing a television series focused on cold cases. The Carla Walker case had come to his attention, and he contacted Wagner and Bennett directly. His offer was practical. He wanted to feature the case on his program. In exchange, he could bring financial resources that a police department cold case unit simply did not have, specifically, funding for advanced DNA testing that was cost-prohibitive without outside support. Wagner and Bennett agreed, with clear terms. Law enforcement retained complete control of the investigation. Holes and his team had access to the story. All case decisions remained with Fort Worth PD. With that funding in place, additional items of Carla's clothing, held in evidence storage since 1974, were sent to a specialized forensic laboratory in California for advanced DNA analysis. The technology available in 2019 was significantly more capable than what had existed when the partial profile was developed in 2009. Methods that had previously been unable to extract usable genetic material from deteriorated evidence were now producing results that had not been possible a decade earlier. The California laboratory returned a result that changed the case. A full DNA profile had been extracted from Carla's bra. Not partial, not fragmented, a complete usable genetic profile of an unknown male. This was a different category of result entirely. A full profile can be run against CODIS with substantially greater precision than a partial one. More importantly, a full profile opens the door to forensic genetic genealogy, a methodology that works not by finding a suspect directly in a criminal database, but by identifying biological relatives who have voluntarily submitted their DNA to consumer ancestry platforms, then building a family tree from those matches until investigators can narrow the search to a specific individual. The full profile was entered into CODIS immediately. No matches came back. Wagner and Bennett absorbed that and kept moving. CODIS only contains profiles from individuals who have been arrested or convicted of offenses requiring DNA collection. If the unknown male had no qualifying criminal history, he would not appear there regardless of how complete the profile was. Forensic genetic genealogy was the next logical step. Holes recommended a company with experience in this work. The DNA extract was sent for processing. Genealogical analysis requires actual biological material to sequence, not just a profile. The laboratory needs the physical extract to generate the genomic data that can be searched against consumer databases. The company processed the submission and then returned news that stopped the entire team cold. The testing had consumed the sample. The genealogical analysis attempt had used the biological material to the point where what remained measured only a few nanograms, a quantity below the minimum threshold required to run the analysis successfully. The attempt had failed, and in failing, it had left the team with a complete DNA profile, a 45-year-old case, and almost no remaining biological evidence to work with. Wagner has described that period as one of the most difficult stretches of the entire investigation. The team had been confident. A full profile had felt like the answer was close, and then a single laboratory report took that away entirely. Holes was equally affected. He had invested significant professional energy in the case and understood better than most what it meant to be this close to a result and have it disappear. But he was not out of options. He had recently become aware of a company doing forensic DNA work, unlike anything else in the field at that time. They were taking samples that other laboratories had rejected, material too deteriorated, too contaminated, or too small to process through conventional methods, and finding ways to extract usable genetic information from them anyway. Their methodology was built specifically for exactly the scenario the Carla Walker case now presented. The company was called Othram. Holes brought their name to Wagner and Bennett. He explained what they did. Bennett was careful. He had watched one laboratory consume their best sample without producing a result. The prospect of handing what little remained to another company, potentially losing it entirely, was not a decision to make lightly. But Bennett agreed to meet with them. Wagner and Bennett drove to Othram's facility in the Woodlands, Texas. They reviewed the company's chain of custody procedures in person. They asked detailed questions about the methodology, about how much material the process consumed, and about what safeguards existed against another failed attempt. What they heard was enough to move forward. Othram's forensic-grade genome sequencing process was specifically built for low-quantity, high-deterioration samples. Where standard forensic DNA testing required a minimum threshold of quality material to function, Othram's sequencing approach could work with quantities far below that level. They also offered a preliminary feasibility assessment, a pre-test to evaluate whether the remaining material had any viable potential before committing to the full process. Wagner and Bennett made the decision. The last remaining DNA extract from Carla Walker's bra strap was shipped to Othram's laboratory. This was the final shot. No additional clothing items, no other biological material that had not already been tested or exhausted. If Othram's process failed or consumed what remained without result, the forensic avenue of this investigation was permanently closed. A family had been waiting 46 years. 2 detectives had spent years rebuilding a case file from scratch. Paul Holes had committed professional resources to make this testing possible. And now every remaining thread of this investigation came down to a trace of biological material on a fabric strap that had been sitting in an evidence box since the winter of 1974. The sample arrived at Othram in June of 2020. The waiting began. If you have never heard of forensic genetic genealogy before this documentary, you are not alone. And what Othram did with that sample over the following weeks demonstrates exactly why this technology matters for thousands of unsolved cases still sitting in evidence rooms across the country. Stay with us. Subscribe if you have not already, because the next chapter is where 46 years of silence begins to break. In June of 2020, the last viable biological evidence from the Carla Walker case arrived at Othram's laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas. To understand what happened next, it is worth understanding exactly what Othram was working with. The material was a microscopic trace of biological evidence recovered from the strap of Carla's bra. It had been collected in February 1974. It had spent decades in evidence storage. By the time it reached Othram, it had been assessed and rejected by multiple forensic laboratories as scientifically unusable. The quantity was more than 10 times smaller than the already depleted sample that the previous company had consumed without producing a result. The condition of the material was poor. The presence of mixed biological material made isolating a single genetic profile extremely difficult using conventional methods. By every standard measurement, this sample should not have been capable of producing anything useful. Dr. Kristen Middleman, Othram's chief development officer, personally took on the case. The decision was deliberate. She did not want to assign it to a junior analyst. She understood what Wagner and Bennett had placed in Othram's hands, and she understood what it meant to the Walker family if this attempt failed the way the previous one had. Standard forensic DNA analysis, the type used in the majority of criminal cases, targets specific locations on the genome called SDR markers, short tandem repeats. It is reliable, legally established, and widely accepted in courtrooms. But it requires a minimum quantity of usable material, and it produces a profile suited only for direct database comparison. Othram's approach works differently. Their process sequences the entire available genome, as much of it as the sample allows, producing a far more complete genetic picture. That picture can then be used for the kind of family-based comparison that forensic genetic genealogy requires. The question it asks is not whether a profile matches someone in a criminal database. It asks whether this genetic data shares characteristics with anyone who has voluntarily submitted their DNA to a consumer ancestry platform. Services like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA, where millions of people have uploaded their genetic information to research their family histories. The initial feasibility assessment came back with a result that genuinely surprised the team. The sample was workable. Not ideal, not clean, but workable. Given what every prior laboratory had concluded about this material, that single word carried enormous weight. Dr. Middleman moved to full forensic-grade genome sequencing. The initial profile construction phase took approximately 1 week. Then the genealogical search began. Othram's analysts uploaded the sequenced genetic data to consumer genealogy databases and began searching for biological relatives of the unknown male in the evidence. In forensic genetic genealogy, finding the actual suspect in a database is rare. What investigators typically find are cousins, second cousins, sometimes closer relatives, people who share enough of the genetic sequence to indicate a family connection. From those connections, genealogists build outward, branch by branch, generation by generation, until the pool of possible individuals narrows to a number that conventional investigation can work with directly. 5 weeks into the process, the data produced something. It was a Saturday morning, July 4th, 2020. Othram's analyst called David Middleman, a key figure in the company's genealogical analysis work, to report that the search had produced what appeared to be a coherent family unit, a cluster of genetic matches pointing consistently toward a specific family line. David Middleman reviewed the data. Then he called Jeff Bennett. Bennett answered. Middleman told him they had a surname. Bennett had spent months reading every page of a case file going back to 1974. He did not need to be told what to do with that information. He asked Middleman to hold on and went to get his suspect binder, the document he and Wagner had built during their comprehensive review of the original case materials, containing all 85 names requiring further investigation. He came back to the phone. Middleman gave him the name. McCurley. Bennett found it immediately. Number 22 on a list of 85. Glenn McCurley. The name had been in the Fort Worth PD case file since April of 1974, when an original investigator had knocked on a door in the area and asked a man about a missing firearm. But there was a complication. Othram's genealogical analysis had traced the genetic matches to Glenn McCurley Sr., and Glenn McCurley Sr. had died in 1972, 2 years before Carla Walker was taken. A man who died in 1972 could not be responsible for a crime committed in 1974. Bennett asked the question the timeline required. Did Glenn McCurley Sr. have a son? Middleman told him the family tree analysis had not reached that level yet. He would call back. Approximately 1 hour later, Middleman called again. Glenn Samuel McCurley Sr. had 3 sons. 2 of them had been living outside of Texas in February of 1974. Their locations could be documented and verified. They could be geographically eliminated. The 3rd son was Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. And in February of 1974, Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. was living in Fort Worth, Texas. Bennett called Lee Wagner immediately. What they had at this point was a powerful investigative lead, but not yet proof. Forensic genetic genealogy identifies family connections. It does not, on its own, constitute criminal evidence. To move this case forward, they needed to connect Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. directly to the biological material from Carla Walker's clothing. They needed his DNA, and they needed to obtain it without alerting him to what was coming. Because Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. had not moved away from Fort Worth. He was still there, still living in the area, still going about his daily life. To all outward appearances, an unremarkable older man in an ordinary neighborhood, with no idea that a laboratory in the woodlands had just spent 5 weeks tracing his family name through a 46-year-old crime scene sample. The investigation was no longer cold. It was closing in. Here is a question worth thinking about. Forensic genetic genealogy has now been used to resolve dozens of cold cases across the United States. Should consumer DNA platforms be required to make their databases available to law enforcement for violent crime investigations? It is an active legal and ethical debate right now. Drop your perspective in the comments, and subscribe to Vanished Without Trace if you have not already. We are not finished yet. Detectives Lee Wagner and Jeff Bennett had a name, a confirmed location, and a genetic lead pointing directly at a man in his mid-70s living quietly in the Fort Worth area. What they did not yet have was his DNA in a form that could be used in court. In a case of this magnitude, one that had survived 46 years, 3 eliminated suspects, 1 false confession, and a laboratory process that had nearly exhausted the last remaining evidence, a single procedural error at this stage could undo everything. Wagner and Bennett were not going to allow that. The first step was a careful, low-profile assessment. Before making any direct contact with Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., investigators needed to confirm basic facts. Was he still at the identified address? Who else lived there? What was the household's daily pattern? These were foundational questions, and answering them required eyes on the property without raising any concern. Fort Worth PD sent a uniformed officer to the McCurley residence under the cover of a routine welfare check, the kind of visit that generates no alarm. The officer was Officer Mullen. His assignment was simple: make contact, assess who is present, observe, and report back. Officer Mullen knocked on the door. Mrs. McCurley answered. She was calm and cooperative and showed no unusual reaction to a uniformed officer on her doorstep. When asked who resided at the address, she said it was herself and her husband. They had been at that address since 1978. While Mullen was still at the door, Glenn McCurley came around from the backyard. What the investigative team noted about that first encounter was McCurley's manner. He was relaxed. He made jokes with the officer. He kept the exchange light and casual, the behavior of either a completely innocent person or a man who had spent decades maintaining a carefully practiced sense of normalcy around law enforcement. He showed no anxiety, no unusual reaction. Mullen completed the visit without disclosing anything about the investigation behind it. He reported back. McCurley was present. The household was confirmed. The next step was the trash run. Under established legal precedent, once a person places their refuse at the curbside for collection, they have legally abandoned it. Law enforcement can retrieve it without a warrant. It is a standard investigative technique used in cases where obtaining a direct biological sample requires either the subject's cooperation or a court order. A team collected 5 bags of trash from the McCurley residence's curbside collection and processed every item. From that material, Investigators identified several items that could potentially carry biological material from Glenn McCurley, sufficient to send for DNA comparison against the full profile Othram had developed from Carla's bra strap. Those items went to the forensic laboratory in California that had conducted the earlier advanced testing on Carla's clothing. The confirmation came back on a McDonald's drinking straw pulled from the trash. The biological material on that straw matched the full DNA profile from Carla Walker's bra strap. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr.'s DNA was on that straw, and the same genetic profile was present on evidence recovered from a 17-year-old girl taken from a parking lot 46 years earlier. The match was scientifically confirmed, but a match established through discarded trash, while forensically significant, was not sufficient for criminal proceedings. Prosecutors would need a directly obtained, formally documented DNA sample from McCurley himself, collected with a clear and documented chain of custody that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. Wagner and Bennett needed to get that sample in person. They chose an out-of-custody approach. No arrest, no patrol vehicles, no visible escalation. 2 detectives, a front door, a conversation about a case from 1974. The reasoning was deliberate. An immediate arrest would almost certainly result in McCurley requesting legal representation before saying anything. An out-of-custody conversation, where he was not under arrest and could theoretically end the interaction at any time, created conditions where he might talk. And talking, for a man who had maintained a secret for 46 years, carried risks he may not have fully appreciated. Wagner and Bennett arrived at the McCurley home unannounced. Mrs. McCurley answered the door. The detectives identified themselves, told her they had reopened an old case from 1974, and asked if they could speak with her and her husband. She invited them in. The 4 of them sat down. Wagner led. She told McCurley they were going back through everyone who had been contacted in connection with the original case, a framing that was accurate and positioned the visit as standard procedure rather than targeted contact. She asked if he remembered the case. He said he did. He mentioned he had seen it referenced on Facebook and was aware it had been reopened. Wagner asked where he had been on the night of February 16, 1974. McCurley said he had probably been driving his wife to and from work that week. Mrs. McCurley corrected him without hesitation. She told him directly, in front of both detectives, that she had not been in Fort Worth at all that week. Her father had been undergoing heart surgery in West Texas. She had been there with him the entire time. Glenn could not have been driving her anywhere that week because she was not there. McCurley's first alibi lasted less than 60 seconds before being dismantled, not by the detectives, but by his own wife. He shifted his account. He told them he had actually gone to Midland that week to be with his own parents because his father was also having surgery. Investigators later found this account equally unverifiable and inconsistent with available records. The conversation moved to the firearm. Wagner raised the Ruger Mark-I, the weapon whose ammunition magazine had been found in the Ridgely parking lot. McCurley acknowledged owning that type of weapon. He said it had been taken from his vehicle, that he had been near a bridge one day, heard something nearby, returned to his car, and the gun was gone. He said he had not reported the theft because he was a convicted felon and was not legally permitted to own a firearm. That admission, offered voluntarily by McCurley, was significant on multiple levels. It confirmed illegal possession. It explained the absence of a theft report, and it aligned directly with what the 1974 investigation had already documented, that one person on the Ruger canvas list could not produce his weapon when asked. Wagner then raised the subject of DNA. She told him that in the reinvestigation, they had asked every man connected to the case for a voluntary DNA sample, that it was the fastest and simplest way to clear someone from consideration. She framed it as routine, the same thing every other person they had spoken to had already done. McCurley pushed back. He suggested DNA had already been collected from him previously, that it had been done years ago. Wagner told him clearly that DNA testing of that kind had not existed during the 1974 investigation. It had not been part of the original process. No prior sample was on record. Mrs. McCurley, without apparent awareness of what she was confirming, agreed with Wagner. She told her husband that they had not done DNA back then. She was helping the detectives make their case without realizing it. Wagner returned to the DNA request several times throughout the conversation, framing it differently each time, not as an accusation, but as an opportunity for McCurley to clear himself the same way every other man they had spoken to had already done. Eventually, Glenn McCurley agreed. A buccal swab was taken. Chain of custody was documented. Wagner and Bennett thanked the McCurleys for their time and left. The swab went to the laboratory. Both detectives already knew what the result was going to be. They were right. Approximately 1 week later, the laboratory confirmed that the DNA profile from Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr.'s buccal swab was a match to the full profile extracted from Carla Walker's bra strap. The same profile confirmed on the McDonald's straw from his trash. The same unknown male present at the scene of Carla Walker's death in February 1974. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., living 1 mile from the Walker family home, married, father of 2 sons, a man whose wife ran a church daycare, a man regarded by his community as an ordinary, unremarkable neighbor. Wagner and Bennett wrote the arrest warrant. The Fort Worth Police Department's fugitive unit took Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. into custody. 46 years, 8 months, and roughly 2 weeks after Carla Walker was taken from a parking lot on Valentine's night, the man responsible for her death was under arrest. Drop your reaction in the comments right now, because when his own wife dismantled his alibi in that living room without realizing what she was doing, what went through your mind? Tell us below. Subscribe to Vanished Without Trace if you have not already. The next chapter is the one this entire case has been building toward: the interrogation, the confession, and a firearm hidden in a ceiling for 46 years. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. was brought into the Fort Worth Police Department by the fugitive unit and placed in an interview room. He was under arrest. His rights had been read to him, and he had chosen, at least in that initial moment, not to request an attorney. That decision would define the next 90 minutes in ways McCurley clearly had not anticipated. Wagner and Bennett entered the room. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. It was measured, patient, and built on an evidentiary foundation so solid that the detectives had no need to raise their voices or manufacture urgency. The DNA match from the buccal swab, combined with the trash sample confirmation and Othram's forensic genealogy work, had already established the basis for prosecution. Wagner and Bennett did not need a confession to charge him. What they wanted from this conversation was the complete account, the details that only the person who had been there could provide. They wanted it for the record, and they wanted it for the Walker family. Bennett opened the interview with a straightforward framework. He told McCurley that the investigation had been thorough, that the evidence pointed to him specifically, that this was his opportunity to provide his own account before the case moved forward entirely on the evidence alone. He framed it around the question of how McCurley wanted to be understood. The evidence, as it stood, presented one picture. If there was anything else, any context, any explanation, now was the time to offer it. McCurley denied everything. He said he had never encountered Carla Walker. He expressed apparent confusion about why he was in that room. He asked when he was supposed to have done any of this. Bennett did not escalate. He returned to the same point, calmly and repeatedly. The evidence existed. It was not subject to change. The question was not whether McCurley had been there; that had already been established scientifically. The question was what had actually happened. For close to an hour, McCurley held his denial. Then the account shifted. Faced with Bennett's continued, evidence-based insistence that the biological match was not going away, McCurley stopped denying his presence at the scene entirely and began building an alternative explanation instead. He told the detectives he had been in the parking lot that night, but he claimed it was not as an aggressor. He said he had seen Rodney and Carla in the front seat of the car, that Rodney appeared to be behaving toward her in a way that concerned him, and that he had approached the vehicle to intervene on Carla's behalf. It was a calculated shift. He was now placing himself at the scene, which the DNA made unavoidable, while attempting to reframe his presence as protective. Wagner and Bennett knew the physical evidence. They knew what Rodney McCoy had reported from the beginning. They knew what the medical examiner had determined in 1974. McCurley's account did not hold together against any of it. Bennett told him directly that what he was describing was not consistent with the physical evidence from the crime scene, that the documented findings told a different story, that no version of an alternative account was going to change what the evidence had already established. Approximately 90 minutes after the interview began, Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. stopped offering alternative explanations. Bennett asked him how Carla Walker had died. There was a pause. McCurley said he had choked her. That admission, delivered quietly, without additional elaboration, after 90 minutes of denial and redirection, was what the Walker family had been waiting 46 years to hear. Wagner and Bennett continued. The manner of death was significant, but not the complete picture the investigation required. They worked through the details methodically. What had happened in the parking lot, what had happened afterward, how Carla's body had ended up in the culvert at Benbrook Lake. McCurley answered inconsistently and incompletely, but he was no longer denying the core of what had happened. The account was moving, even if it was fragmentary. There was one point where he held firm throughout the entire interview. The gun. McCurley maintained consistently that he had not had the Ruger Mark-I with him on the night of February 16, 1974. He repeated the same account he had given Wagner and Bennett during the out-of-custody visit, that the weapon had been taken from his vehicle before that night. He did not have it. It was gone. Bennett did not accept this. The ammunition magazine recovered from the Ridgely parking lot had been connected to a Ruger Mark-I from the first days of the investigation. Rodney McCoy had described being struck with a firearm during the attack. The weapon and the crime were inseparable in the documented record of the case. Bennett told McCurley plainly that withholding this detail served no purpose at this stage, that the detectives needed the complete account, and that an incomplete account undermined the credibility of everything else he had said. McCurley continued to deny having the gun. Bennett asked him directly where the firearm was. And Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr., the man who had maintained total silence about this crime for 46 years, told them. He said it was in a small room, up in the ceiling, at his house. Wagner and Bennett obtained a search warrant for the McCurley residence within hours. A team executed it. They went to the location McCurley had described, through the laundry area, up into the ceiling space, behind a section of paneling that had been deliberately installed to conceal what was behind it. Behind that paneling, wrapped in a towel, was a firearm. The Ruger Mark-I, .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The weapon used in the attack on Rodney McCoy in the Ridgely bowling alley parking lot on the night of February 16, 1974. McCurley had not just held onto it. He had moved it through at least one house relocation and deliberately created a hidden space for it. The home where he was arrested was not the property where he had lived in 1974, meaning the firearm had been transported and reconcealed at some point across those 46 years, possibly more than once. That level of sustained, deliberate concealment tells its own story. A firearm stored behind paneling in a ceiling space is not something a person feels neutral about. Whether the attachment was psychological, practical, or something else entirely, it had been kept, hidden, carefully, for nearly half a century. When Jim Walker received the call from Jeff Bennett confirming the arrest, he and his remaining family went online to find out what they could about the man who had taken Carla. What they found was something that stopped them completely. The distance from the Walker family's front door to the McCurley residence was approximately 1 mile. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. had been living in that proximity to the family he had devastated since at least 1978, 4 years after Carla's death. He had raised 2 sons in that neighborhood. His wife had run a church daycare from their home. He had been regarded, by everyone who knew him, as an entirely ordinary member of the community. He had been there the entire time. Jim Walker has described the moment of learning that detail in terms that require no additional framing. The family moved through relief, rage, grief, and disbelief simultaneously. The man they had called the bad guy for nearly 5 decades, the faceless threat that had permanently changed how an entire community moved through the world, had a name, an address, and a house that sat less than a mile from the home where Carla grew up. Detective Wagner called Rodney McCoy personally. She told him they had the right person, that it was confirmed. Rodney McCoy, the 17-year-old who had been struck unconscious in a parking lot in 1974, who had spent the decades since carrying the weight of that night, along with the quiet residual suspicion that follows surviving boyfriends in unsolved cases, received that information and understood what it meant. Not just for the Walker family. For him. McCurley entered a not guilty plea the day after his confession. The case was going to trial. Drop a comment right now. We want to know what you think about one specific detail. Glenn McCurley kept that gun hidden in his ceiling for 46 years and carried it through at least one house move. What does that tell you about him? Tell us in the comments. Share this documentary tonight. Subscribe if you have not already. The courtroom chapter is next, and it is not a straightforward path to a verdict. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. had confessed in that interview room. He had directed investigators to the firearm hidden in his ceiling. He had confirmed, after 90 minutes of resistance, that he had choked Carla Walker. Then he woke up the following morning and withdrew it all. McCurley entered a not guilty plea. The case that had taken 46 years and 3 separate rounds of forensic testing to build was going to trial. For the Walker family, that decision was another layer of difficulty placed on top of decades of accumulated loss. A confession followed by a not guilty plea meant a courtroom. It meant evidence laid out publicly before a jury. It meant reliving February 1974 in a Tarrant County courthouse in August 2021. It meant that the answer the family had finally received was now going to be formally contested by the man who had given it. For the prosecution, it meant something different. It meant pressure of a kind that had not existed in any prior Texas criminal case. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case was Kim Davenin, a senior prosecutor in the Tarrant County District Attorney's office with substantial trial experience. When Davenin began working through the evidentiary foundation of the Carla Walker case, she encountered a problem that no Texas prosecutor had faced before. Forensic genetic genealogy had never been used as evidence in a Texas criminal trial. Not once. The science behind it was valid. The methodology had been peer-reviewed and validated in forensic and academic settings. It had been used to identify suspects in other states. But no Texas court had ever been asked to formally evaluate whether forensic genetic genealogy met the legal standards required for admission as criminal evidence. The question of its reliability, its methodology, and its chain of custody had never been argued before a Texas judge. Davenin was the first prosecutor in the state to have to answer that question in a courtroom. She has spoken in detail about the weight of that position. If the DNA evidence was challenged successfully and ruled inadmissible, the case against McCurley, built almost entirely on that forensic foundation, would collapse. And the consequences would reach far beyond this single case. A ruling against admissibility would set a precedent affecting every cold case in Texas being actively worked using the same technology. Investigators across the state were watching this trial closely because their own cases depended on how this one went. The stakes extended well beyond Carla Walker's family. Davenin built her scientific presentation from the ground up. She engaged experts in forensic genomics and genetic genealogy methodology. She prepared to walk the court through every step of the forensic chain. The original evidence collection in 1974, the decades of storage, the multiple rounds of testing, Othram's genome sequencing process, the genealogical analysis that produced the McCurley surname, the trash run confirmation, and the directly obtained buccal swab that locked the profile to Glenn McCurley specifically. McCurley's defense attorney responded by filing multiple motions to suppress the DNA evidence. The central argument was straightforward. A methodology that had never been tested in a Texas courtroom could not meet the reliability standards required for admission. If the genealogy evidence was excluded, the straw confirmation was excluded, and the entire forensic chain leading from a 1974 crime scene to a specific individual in 2020 was gone. The prosecution would have very little remaining to stand on. The trial opened in August of 2021 in Tarrant County. The first 3 days were consumed almost entirely by the legal battle over the DNA evidence. Expert witnesses testified on both sides. The defense challenged the methodology at every point. Davenin presented the scientific validation, the peer-reviewed research supporting forensic genetic genealogy, and the specific quality controls Othram had applied throughout their analysis of the Carla Walker sample. On the third day of trial, the judge issued his ruling. The forensic genetic genealogy evidence was admissible. It was a landmark ruling. The first time a Texas court had formally evaluated this technology and determined it met the legal threshold for criminal evidence. Cold case investigators across the state who had been following the proceedings understood immediately what that ruling meant for their own pending cases. The door that Davenin had fought to open was now open, for this case, and for every case like it in Texas going forward. For McCurley's defense, the primary line of legal attack had been closed off. The morning after the admissibility ruling, as both sides prepared to continue, McCurley's defense attorney approached Davenin and asked to speak privately. He told her his client wanted to plead guilty. After 3 days of fighting to keep the DNA evidence out of the courtroom, after filing motion after motion to suppress the forensic foundation of the entire prosecution, Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. had watched the judge rule against him on the central issue and decided he was finished. The guilty plea was entered. The judge proceeded directly to sentencing. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Carla Walker. He was 77 years old at the time of sentencing. Under Texas law, given both the nature of the offense and his age, the practical reality of a life sentence was that he would almost certainly die in custody. Before sentencing was formally concluded, the court heard victim impact statements. Jim Walker stood up. The same Jim Walker who, as a 7-year-old boy, had seen Rodney McCoy at the front door in 1974. The same Jim Walker who had sat alone in a culvert with a hammer in 1979. The same Jim Walker who had called Detective Wagner in 2017 and asked, with the directness of a man who had waited long enough, for someone to please not let his sister's case disappear. He stood up and faced Glenn McCurley directly. He did not raise his voice. He did not break down. He told McCurley that because of his faith, because of his personal relationship with God, as he put it, he was choosing to forgive him. Not to reduce what had been done. Not to suggest that 47 years of loss and unanswered questions had not cost the Walker family in ways that could never be fully measured. But to forgive, because, as Jim Walker made clear, forgiveness was something he was doing for himself and for the people he loved, not a gift to the man sitting across from him. It was one of the most controlled and powerful moments in a case built on powerful moments. After sentencing concluded, Detective Lee Wagner raised something with Jeff Bennett that had been on her mind since the arrest. The promise ring. The ring Rodney McCoy had given Carla as a symbol of their commitment. The ring found in the dirt near her body in the culvert in February 1974. The ring that had spent nearly 5 decades in an evidence box as part of the case file. The ring whose removal from Carla's finger, while all her other jewelry remained untouched, had been a quietly examined detail in the original investigation. Wagner asked Bennett what he thought about returning it to Rodney. Bennett said it was the right thing to do. With the necessary legal permissions in place following the conclusion of the case, Wagner and Bennett presented the ring to Rodney McCoy in person. Rodney had been 17 years old when Carla was taken from him in that parking lot. In the decades that followed, he had built a life, functional, successful by external measure, while carrying the invisible weight of that night. The residual suspicion that had attached to him in the early days of the investigation, the kind that follows the surviving boyfriend in any unsolved case, had never fully gone away from public perception even after he had been cleared. The psychological cost of living with that for 47 years was something only Rodney could fully account for. When the ring was returned, Rodney's daughter was present. She spoke to Bennett afterward. She said the resolution of the case, the arrest, the conviction, the formal public confirmation that Rodney had always been exactly who he said he was, had helped her father find himself again. Bennett has described that exchange as one of the most meaningful moments of his career. Someone asked Rodney how he felt. He considered the question. Then he said one word. Healed. Glenn Samuel McCurley Jr. served approximately 2 years of his life sentence before dying in prison at the age of 78. He never provided a complete account of everything that occurred on the night of February 16, 1974. He never explained the full sequence of events in detail, and he went to his death having declined to answer questions about whether he had been responsible for other crimes beyond Carla Walker's murder. That final point carries weight. During the custodial interview, when detectives pressed McCurley about where exactly he had left Carla after the attack, specifically why her body ended up in the culvert at Benbrook Lake, his answers did not correspond to where she was found. He described a location that had nothing to do with where investigators had recovered her body. Both Wagner and Bennett interpreted that inconsistency the same way. It suggested a level of familiarity with the act of disposing of a victim that pointed toward prior experience. This had not been the first time. McCurley had worked for years as a long-haul truck driver, running routes between Fort Worth and California. The corridor between Texas and the West Coast in the 1970s produced a significant number of unsolved cases involving young women, cases that have never been conclusively connected to a single perpetrator, but that investigators have long considered potentially related. Detectives identified at least one case they believed McCurley may have been involved in. A young woman named Becky Martin had been found in a drainage culvert in the Fort Worth area in 1973, a year before Carla's death, under circumstances that bore striking similarity to how and where Carla was found. The location, the method, the timeline of McCurley's presence in the area. Investigators considered the connection credible enough to pursue formally. 2 weeks before a planned interview with McCurley, specifically about Becky Martin and other potential cases, Glenn McCurley died in prison. Whatever he knew about other victims, he did not share it. What he could not take with him was the impact of Carla Walker's case on the future of forensic justice in Texas. Jim Walker, in the aftermath of the conviction, was clear about what he wanted. He wanted his sister's name to mean something beyond what had happened to her. He worked with legislators and law enforcement advocates to push for formal funding of forensic genetic genealogy as a recognized investigative tool in Texas. The result was the Carla Walker Act. The legislation established a pilot program to provide state funding for forensic genetic genealogy analysis in cold cases, making Texas one of the first states in the country to formally legislate financial support for this technology in criminal investigations. The act acknowledged what the McCurley case had demonstrated in court, that this was not a speculative methodology. It was a validated, court-accepted forensic tool that deserved structured, funded deployment across the state. The framework referenced more than 280 forensic laboratories across the country that could implement this technology under a standardized system. The stated goal was direct: use what worked in Carla's case to bring answers to other families still waiting for theirs. Carla Walker's name now exists in Texas law. A 17-year-old girl who attended a Valentine's dance and never came home became, nearly 5 decades after her death, the foundation of legislation designed to prevent other families from waiting as long as hers did. That kind of legacy is not something that can be planned or manufactured. It can only be earned through decades of persistence from a brother who never accepted silence as a final answer, through detectives who read every page of a 46-year-old case file and built a new investigation from the ground up, through a forensic scientist who accepted a sample every other laboratory had rejected, and through a technology that converted a microscopic trace of biological material into the answer a family had been owed since 1974. Because of the people who refused to accept that her case would stay unsolved, her name now means something far beyond the worst night of her life. This has been the Carla Walker case on Vanished Without Trace. If this documentary gave you something today, if it gave you facts you had not seen before, perspective on how forensic investigation actually works, or simply the story of a family that refused to give up, then do 3 things right now. Subscribe to this channel. We cover cases like this every single week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Carla Walker's story deserves to be known beyond Texas. You can help make that happen. And drop a comment below telling us which part of this case stayed with you the most. Was it the 47 years Glenn McCurley lived 1 mile from the Walker family? Was it the McDonald's straw that confirmed his identity? Was it Jim Walker standing in that courtroom and choosing forgiveness after 47 years? Was it Rodney McCoy's single word, healed? Tell us, because this community exists on the belief that these cases matter, these victims matter, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, is always worth pursuing. Rest in peace, Carla Walker. May 18, 1956, February 17, 1974. We did not forget you.